Hello and welcome to this video on a particularly unique kind of beer. Lembic beer or Lambic beer, depending on where you are from, is a unique beer in that it does not rely on a particular and pure yeast strain. Rather, it relies on wild yeast and other microorganisms that can drastically alter the flavour. Most often this is similar to something like sourdough in that you get a combination of yeast and another bacterium that will create particular flavours. In the case of sourdough, it's lactobacillus. With Lambic or Lembic beers, it can vary significantly from location to location. In some ways, Lembic beer is very similar to a saison. They are very soft in the body, tend to be hazy, a golden-like colour, but also carbonated, although Lembic beers tend to be less carbonated, or at least feel less so. What you will normally use to make a Lembic beer is some sort of barley malt as the predominant ingredient, somewhere up to 70%, although some use as little as 60%. You also add wheat to this. This makes up the majority of the remainder of all of your fermentables, so anywhere between 30 and 40%. This is then processed and allowed to cool overnight. It's cooled in a wide flat pan. This is done for two reasons. The first and simplest is that more surface area will cool it quicker. The second is somewhat more important. This is where the inoculation occurs. Because you have lots of nice surface area full of what could otherwise be fermentable sugars, which are nutrition to many organisms, this gets, for lack of a better word, contaminated with various microorganisms, including but not limited to yeast. In order for this to happen, the wort is always cooled in a very cold environment, normally considered something around cellar temperature, which is between -8 and +8 degrees Celsius or 18 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if the process used of cooling the wort doesn't work, when this gets transitioned to the wooden barrels that are used to ferment, the bacteria and yeast within those wooden barrels that have perforated deep into the wood grain will come out and take over for anything that hasn't managed to inoculate it by itself. There are more than 80 different microorganisms that have been found to have a role in Lembic beers. For the most part, these are your usual suspects when it comes to beer, or at least the first is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or your brewer's yeast. There is also Saccharomyces pastorianus and Brettanomyces bruxellinus. These are fairly common microorganisms, and for flavours, you would be surprised at how commonly they occur. In many countries, and this is something you will need to consider for your brewing of this if you so wish, it can only be done at certain times of the year, mostly between October and May in the Northern Hemisphere, and somewhere between April and August in the Southern Hemisphere, basically the end of autumn through to the start of spring. Summer is simply too warm, and this will give rise to too many microorganisms that could actually be bad for your brewing experience. As a general rule, a Lembic beer is made from two different beers, if not more. They blend these to give it the flavour that is characteristic. This is an important characteristic of it, as much like things like whiskey or even wine blends, you need to have this mixture. Without that, you can't account for all of the different flavours. It's also why one particular kind of beer from a brewer may be slightly different from those made at the same brewery a year or two later. This also means that you may find that a particular kind of Lembic beer has been moved between multiple cellars over different years, and this is because they have had different beers added to them. Another feature of this blending process is the inclusion of fruit-based versions to counteract some of the bitterness of Lembic beers. When they are either brewed or blended again, often things like sugar are added, and this is especially more common when going to serve, as again, it counteracts some of that bitterness. While the yeast source of a Lembic beer is somewhat vague, there are some rather hard rules, and this can be both in terms of law, as in the legal system, where Lembic beer is regulated under European law in some countries, but also that some things must be done for Lembic beer to be a true Lembic beer and not just stylized. With that in mind, we have 3 different types of Lembic beer that we'll describe, these being Lembic, Fruit Lembic, and Gueuze. For lambic beer or lembic beer, you need the mixtures of wild yeast and bacteria to get the right flavour. As mentioned, this will vary considerably between each batch. This is one reason why a large batch brewing is perhaps better if you know what you're doing, but smaller batches are better if you're still learning. Notably because you can change small things and those small tweaks can have big results. We've mentioned that you need at least 30% unmalted wheat and up to 70% malted barley. This combination can vary between 30 and 40 for unmalted wheat and 60 and 70 for the barley. The hops themselves are aged for at least a year, and some brewers will extend that time frame to many years. The effect of this is that the aromatics and taste of the hops is almost entirely gone, and this is particularly good. Hops brings with it a very strong taste of bitterness, and this is already a particularly bitter beer. The beer is then aged for at least 1 year, although 2 is typical, and you can find some brewers who go even further again. The fruit lambic beer is somewhat different, but not by much. Primarily that the fruit adds a certain flavour to it rather than sweetness, although it has some of the same effect, and by having this fruit flavour, you counteract some of the bitterness. Admittedly, it's more like an aromatic flavour rather than a covering flavour. It makes it somewhat less complex and less sour, but it does then complement the flavour of berries. Including things like cherries and raspberries are pretty common. The last is gueuze, and gueuze is the combination of old and new batches of beer. This again is one of those instances where you'll find that brewers will use multiple different breweries' product to try and get just the right flavour that they want, and these can be very complex because of that. It's very similar, as mentioned, to things like blending of whiskies and other distilled spirits. You need to balance out everything just right. Like a blended whiskey, this can in some cases be quite old beer, or at least relative to what most people are familiar with beer that's 1, 2, 3 and even more years old used in the process. These are nearly always carbonated. This does add somewhat to the bitterness or tartness of the beverage, but at the same time, you're probably not going to notice the difference unless you're looking for it. There is a catch to lambic beer, and we've mentioned this before. It's usually blended from at least 2 different beers. There is, however, unblended lambic beer, and this is generally going to be very cloudy, uncarbonated, and incredibly sour. The reason for this is that you've done nothing to counteract that bitterness generated by the other microorganisms. It's nearly always only available as a very limited run bottle. They are limited runs, or for lack of a better word, collectibles, as there isn't a large market for it. The market that is there is very demanding of them, and since you can't really try and sell it as something like on a keg or otherwise readily available in a bar, pub or similar, it just doesn't have that kind of revenue return for the effort put into it. When released, it's either going to be sold as Jong, which is young, or Oud, which is old, and as a result of this, you will find that different countries offer different ways. Belgium is the most common one to try and sell and produce lambic beer, and fortunately they're really the only one does it on a large scale, and this is also where those terms come from. When you do eventually get your hands on a bottle of this, serving it is surprisingly simple in some ways. You need to serve it at a particular temperature, generally cellar temperature, so somewhere around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius or between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Basically fridge temperature. You put it in a tulip glass or a straight walled glass, and you can, if you wish, try and sweeten it with sugars. The other option is to add something like a fruit or berry mixture to it, whether that is whole macerated fruits and berries or juices thereof. Alternatively, you can serve it in other glasses if you wish to enjoy the aromatic flavours to it, something like a brandy glass or a snifter, and sometimes champagne flutes are used. The overall process for creating lambic beer is very much similar to creating regular beer. The only differences are at the very start, when you're cooling your wort, and the end result in flavour, and it shows you just how important strict quality control of yeast can be. If you don't get the right yeast, you can get something with a very different flavour. At the same time, Lambic beer is a way for you to try your hand at something with a very different flavour. That is, if you have the right environmental conditions and are willing to see what happens with just how bitter a brew you can make at home, or somewhere similar. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.